As you've already heard from Milo, Nathan Fuentes is our speaker today in his senior sermon. Nathan, do you have anybody you'd like to introduce?
This is my mother. She's here in the Philippines.
Well, Nathan has been around Lubbock for a little bit, having already lived here for quite a while, attending Texas Tech. His father had a huge influence on him to come to school. Many of us that have been around here a while remember June, and what a great just honor it has been to have him and this family as they continue on to be with us for a while. We asked a couple of different questions about that. Why'd you come to Sunset? And he mentions that he came here to strengthen his knowledge in the Word and then also strengthen his own faith. And Nathan, I think that's exactly what has happened while you've been here. We've watched you grow in all of those areas. He also mentions what have been some of the joys and trials here. He said, yeah, joys and trials, and then joys in trials. Good to think about that as well, how God has brought you through some of those difficulties. We asked Nathan to describe himself in some of the godly terms that God has been growing in him over these years with us, and he said, I've grown in meekness and in patience and in encouraging others. If you're in class with Nathan, sometimes it's a little jab that's kind of encouraging, but a lot of times it's some really good words that we hear from him, and we appreciate that so much. We asked him, where do you plan to go after sunset? What are your dreams and goals? He wants to work with the Middle Church of Christ as the worship leader and work with Heritage Bible College as a teacher during summer classes. Know that they've already got plans for you, I think, in putting you to work pretty quickly in that. And so we're excited to have him. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn over to Esther chapter 4. And I'll be reading verse 14. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai replies, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Nathan, come preach the word, brother.
Good morning. It's always so exciting to be up here. It's a privilege every single time. And thank you for those kind words, Kevin. It really means a lot. Thank you to the faculty and the staff and everything you've done here. It's felt more like a family than a school, and I think that says a lot about the kind of environment we have here, as well as my fellow students. I got the opportunity of being with 3 separate classes, and it has been so amazing to get to know each and every one of you, and I can't wait to see what God does with you in this overall plan that we get to be a part of together. So, thank you. I know you're already wondering, because you're looking at me, right? I know you're already wondering, so I'll let you know, this is called a barong. In my, where I'm from in the Philippines, this is something that you wear on special occasions. My grandfather was the kind of man that every time he preached, he would wear a barong because it's special to be able to preach the word of God, and I share the sentiment. So I'm before you today in one as well, and also just a little, pride being Filipino, right? But I'm going to continue by telling you a little bit more about myself. Growing up, I loved Old Testament Bible stories, don't you? I grew up hearing stories of Jonah and the big fish, Daniel and the lion's den, all this stuff that King David did. The book of Esther, right? And today, we're going to be in the book of Esther chapter 4. So if you want to turn over there, go ahead and be over there. That's where we will be this morning. So a little bit of context before we get to chapter 4. I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of what has come thus far. So this book takes place 100 years after the Babylonian exile. If you're here in school, you should know what that is. If you don't, there's time to fix that before you graduate. But the Babylonian reign has already come to an end, making way for the Persian Empire, and this takes place in Susa in Persia. So in chapters 1 and 2, we open with King Xerxes holding a magnificent feast. And when I mean feast, I mean like magnificent feast. We just finished having Thanksgiving, so we know what it means to feast, and that was maybe a week at most for some of us. But what we're talking about here is 180 days. Imagine 180 days of the food that was on your table, times 10. I don't know how big this feast was. I wasn't invited. But this is 180 days of feasting. So that's just by food amount that he could supply. Imagine the kind of wealth this guy has, right? And this entire time, to all his guests, he's showing off all his wonderful, beautiful possessions. And at the point of 180 days, he calls for his wife, Queen Vashti, to be called out so that she may be looked on as one of his beautiful prized possessions. And she says, no, I will not do that. And this enrages the king. And so he has her dethroned as queen, thrown out, and has a decree made that no one can just come and see the king anymore off their own accord. He has to call for them. And if they do come in off their own accord without his permission, death. That's what awaits you, death. If I don't want to see you, death. And so, now that he's dethroned Vashti, he starts to hold a beauty pageant. Let's just call it what it is, right? A beauty pageant to find his new wife. And all these women, all beautiful virgins in Susa, are called to be a part of this pageant. And they will endure 12 months, 6 months of oil treatments, 6 months of perfume and cosmetics, and the entire time will be on a special diet so that she will look her best in front of the king to win his favor. Now let me ask you, this beauty pageant and the requirements of it, what kind of woman do you think he's looking for? You think Xerxes is looking for an intellectual woman? For a stately woman? A woman well-versed in politics who will reign beside him as someone to help in his kingdom? A protector of her people? No, I don't think so. It's at this point we reach chapter 2, and we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. In the text, we know that Mordecai is, okay, let me map this out for you. So Esther is Mordecai's uncle's daughter who is orphaned, and he adopts her, right? I always remembered him as her uncle, but there's a whole thing there, so he's family nonetheless, right? So we'll just call him family. He's a relative. But he's family nonetheless. And so we're introduced to them at this point because Esther gets put into this beauty pageant, and she is instructed to hide her Jewish heritage. And so she does. And she goes through these 12 months of requirements, makes it in front of the king. She gains his favor and is crowned queen. And so while she's having her crowning moment, Mordecai has been at the gates of the palace this entire time reading her on. And he overhears, while at this moment, 2 guards plot for the king's demise. He goes and tells Esther, Esther tells the king, and the king acknowledges Mordecai for having saved his life. Chapter 3 is where we meet Haman. And if you've ever seen a soap opera or a Netflix show, this is the bad guy. This is the guy that you don't want coming into the scene at this moment. There's like a dun, dun, dun music that's playing right now as he comes in, right? And he is essentially the king's second. And he has been elevated in this high position in the kingdom, the second only to the king, right? And he loves this power. So much so that he commands that everyone he passes must bow before him when he goes by. And so he's leaving the palace one day, going out the front gates, and everyone's bowing as they do, except one guy. He finds out his name is Mordecai. He finds out that he's a Jew, and he marches straight back into the palace, goes to King Xerxes and says, I want all the Jews destroyed because they don't respect me. And if you do this, I'll even sweeten the pot in the kingdom's treasury. And so the king agrees. And they celebrate with a banquet. You'll notice that's a running theme in the book of Esther. There will be a banquet at one point or another. And so they're celebrating. And that's where we get to chapter 4. And this is where we can slow down. But in chapter 4, let us start reading in verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Esther doesn't know what's going on. So she goes and she sends one of her attendants to check on her family. Why is he like this right now? Can you make sure he's all right? And so she sends someone. Verse 6. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So Esther sends someone to attend and minister on her behalf to her family. And Mordecai, in turn, tells her, Esther, this is what's been going on. Here's the paperwork. Everything's been signed. It's ready to go. We are meant to die. Do something. Go and speak to your husband on our behalf, on the behalf of your people. And he pleads with his relative to do this. Do a solid for them, right? And so it continues in verse 9. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So Mordecai has asked this of Esther. You're right there. You're his wife. Go and say something for your people. And she goes, Mordecai, don't you remember how I got here in the first place? Why I'm even queen now? I'm here because his last wife upset him. If I go in now, I'm dead. I'm only going to be okay going in as if he wants to see me. And it's been 30 days. Do you think he wants to see me? Verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, and you and your family will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? So what does Mordecai do here? He instills courage into Esther. He encourages her. He gives her courage. But how does he do it? By reminding her who she is. Yes, Esther, you are queen of Susa. You are wife of Xerxes. But don't forget, you are also Hadassah. You're a Jewish woman. And we have a God that is more powerful than any Persian king. And he made us a promise. He promised he would look out for us. It says here, we know that deliverance will come for the Jews and will arise from another place if you don't do it. And what he does for her is he invites her to be a part of the plan that they know as Jews awaits them by reminding her who she is. Verse 15, when Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." And this is the line I think we all love from Esther. "And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. I love this story. But here's the thing about Old Testament stories. We've heard this a while, and we know stories like this. But here's the thing about Old Testament stories, is they're not stories. This is history. And it baffles me that there was a woman at some point in time whose words echoed in the air, "If I perish, I perish." That is courage. In the face of death, that is courage. But I got to ask you something. If you got to read the book of Esther, I know I gave you a synopsis up until this point, so I told you what's happened throughout. But if I had the opportunity to sit down and read this entire book word for word, and if you did too, if you're an observant reader, you may notice that God has not really been mentioned in this book. Not in the sense that we're used to of, and God came and said this to this person, or God reached in and he twisted the plan here to make sure that this happened. We don't get that in this book. And I gotta ask, is that weird to acknowledge, to think of? Is it weird to think that God isn't mentioned so overtly as we're used to in Old Testament stories? And then a bigger question, because I'm not gonna let you finish pondering that. Is God, what is it saying, right? Like, does it say that if God is not mentioned, is it the same as him not being present? Is God not being mentioned the same as him not being active in the story we've seen? But we can see it, can't we? Of course, because it doesn't say specifically, "This was God here," we can see it. For there to have been a pageant that included a bunch of women in the empire of Susa, for a Jewish woman to come in with her identity hidden and make it not just as one of his wives or concubines or whatever, to be his wife, the queen of Susa. Is that coincidence? That in the peoples of God's time of need, there would be someone right there in the top three. King Xerxes, Haman, his right-hand guy, and his wife on his left. You think that's a coincidence? That there would be someone to do something for the people of God when the time arose? So what do we learn about God? Because even Mordecai figures this out. He says to Esther at this point, "Who knows, but you've come into your royal position for such a time as this." So what do we learn about God? We learn that he is always working on his plan, even if it's not obvious to us. And Mordecai even says, if you don't act, deliverance will arise from somewhere else. We know that he will deliver us, but you have been given an opportunity to use your voice here, Esther. And so I can't help but look at the characters in this story. Obviously, I'm going to look at Esther, because her namesake in the book, right? But also Mordecai. Because when you look at Esther, I can't help but look at the courage she presents. To do what is right, even if others in your circle feel otherwise. Those of you who have already taken spiritual disciplines and Christian counseling and all those things know that this is called self-differentiation. This is the act of her putting herself out there. And so, let me ask you something about courage. When I say courage, what comes to mind immediately? Maybe it's the kind of media I consume. I like period pieces. So like when I think of courage, I think of knights in shining armor on horses, charging sword first into battle, fearless. But courage in actuality is not the lack of fear, as we're so used to. Courage is not the lack of fear, but the ability to still act and do what needs to be done despite it. And Esther does that. We see that she was scared. She even mentioned to Mordecai, like, look, it's been a long time, and if I go in, I die. But because of his encouragement, she goes from that to revealing herself to be a Jew for the good of her people, even if it is to her own detriment. I want to ask, has there ever been a time in your life when you felt the need to hide your identity in Christ? And when the moment arose, or when it will arise, to bring God into a situation, will you do it? When the moment arises, will you act for God or not? We see the Bible is full of opportunities like this. Obviously, in the book of Esther, we see Esther have the opportunity to speak up on behalf of her people. Mary had the opportunity of bringing baby Jesus into the world, to be the one through him she would give birth. Moses was given the opportunity to lead God's people in the Exodus out of Egypt. We are given opportunities, and it's on a moment-by-moment basis. So will you act for God or won't you? And so I encourage us to have courage to use our voice like Esther. But also, I want us to look at Mordecai, because I feel like we don't look at him as often as we do Esther, which is fine. The book is named after her. But he does a beautiful thing for Esther. He encourages Esther. And encouragement is very simply instilling courage into someone else because of the courage you have. And so he does this beautiful thing of encouraging his family by reminding her of who she is, reminding her of her identity. I know you hid it to get this far, but it's time for you to show who you are. And it encourages her. We see the work of God, don't we? Like in our lives today. We see sometimes the way that God works on our lives, mostly in hindsight. But sometimes we're also noticing the people around us, the way that God is using them in this moment. So we're not always the Esther of our stories. Sometimes we know an Esther. And Mordecai gives her this really beautiful thing. He provides her with community. Outside these walls is not only him, these palace walls, is not only him, but he also helps her get all the other Jews in the kingdom to back her up. He rallies them up for her to fast together. Sometimes we are not the ones who are in the thick of it, but we can be the encouragement one needs to make it through their time of difficulty. So focusing on community and family, this is a beautiful thing that we can provide for people. Because it starts off this way, right? Because Esther goes in to minister to Mordecai, and it ends up Mordecai ministering to Esther, and then she invites all of her people into this thing that's on her heart and mind that she knows affects all of them, and they're all thinking about anyways. And so they have the encouragement of community and being there for one another. I can't help but think of the Romans passages, specifically in chapters 12 and 14, where it tells us, be devoted to one another in verse 10. Honor one another above yourselves. In 14:19, build up one another. This is not a new concept for us or a forgotten concept for us. Unity and togetherness, community and family are things that have always been important in the family of God. So, at this point, Esther takes courage and goes to the king at her own banquet. See, I told you there would be another banquet. Reveals her identity to him, to her husband, and Haman's plan against her people. And suddenly, everything starts to make sense for why this is a big deal for Esther. And he's just like, no, this is my wife's people. And the Jewish people are then given an opportunity to fight back on this day, to defend themselves. And Mordecai is elevated in the land of Susa. So we know the story of Esther. She ended up where she was, perhaps not by Xerxes' intentions of just having a beautiful wife. but our beauty and significance has already been defined by the King. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, we know that we can approach God's throne with confidence to receive mercy and find grace in our time of need. There's no need to be afraid of our King. So, have courage in proclaiming who you are like Esther. Encourage one another like Mordecai, Esther, and the Jews do in their kingdom. And remember who you are and whose you are, and that the people of God are always being looked after, and that the Lord is always working and taking care of his people. As I was leaving here and pondering my 2 weeks left, maybe 1 week left, I don't know how gracious my teachers will be, I wanted to think of something to depart with, and I couldn't let go of this. It's a message for me as much as it is for you, and a reminder for me as much as it is for you. As you leave this place, don't forget the family you have here in your time of need, and the God through which we are all family. The lesson is yours.